The room was dim and smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic. The ultrasound machine hummed softly, a steady mechanical breathing that felt oddly comforting. I stood beside the exam table, my wife's hand warm in mine, watching the gray-blue shapes flicker across the screen. This was supposed to be one of those moments you remember forever, for the right reasons. The kind you tell people about with a smile. The doctor leaned closer, moving the probe with practiced precision, his expression neutral, professional, almost bored. Then he stopped. Not gradually, not thoughtfully. He froze, his hand hovering in midair as if the screen had burned him. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, not with confusion, but with something sharper. Calculation. He glanced at me, then back at the monitor, then at my wife. The room felt smaller, the hum of the machine suddenly too loud. "Give me a moment," he said too quickly. He turned the screen slightly away. "Sir, could you step outside with me?" I followed him into the hallway, my heart already racing for reasons I couldn't explain. He closed the door behind us and lowered his voice. "You need to get a divorce," he said, "immediately." I laughed once short and disbelieving. "What? There isn't time to explain everything right now," he said, eyes locked on mine. "But you are not safe." "That's insane," I said. "You're talking about my wife, my child." "I know," he replied quietly. "And when you see what I've seen, you'll understand." That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my life began to collapse silently, without warning. Earlier that morning, I had woken up convinced the day would be simple. Good, even. I remember standing in the shower, letting the water pound against my shoulders, thinking about how strange it was that after years of chaos, my life had settled into something almost gentle. The appointment was routine. Another check-in, another reassuring heartbeat on a screen. I had even joked with my wife about stopping for coffee afterward, about which pastry we'd argue over and end up sharing anyway. I dressed carefully the way I always did when I wanted to feel in control. A clean shirt, shoes polished out of habit more than necessity. I told myself that stability was built from small, repeated choices. Show up. Be present. Don't rush. Don't panic. I had lived by those rules for years, and they had served me well. The drive to the clinic was quiet. My wife talked about nothing in particular, about a neighbor who had repainted their house, about a book she wanted to finish before the baby arrived. I listened, nodded, reached over at a stoplight to squeeze her knee. She smiled at me, that familiar expression that always seemed to say, "We're fine. We're doing this right." I believed her. In the waiting room, everything looked the same as it always had. Neutral art on the walls. Chairs arranged to discourage conversation. A television murmuring softly with a daytime talk show no one was actually watching. I filled out a form I'd filled out before writing my name, her name, the date. It all felt procedural, safe. Boring, even. That boredom now felt like a luxury I hadn't known I was about to lose. Inside the exam room, I stood where I always stood, slightly out of the way, but close enough to feel involved. The technician spoke in a calm, reassuring tone, narrating what she saw on the screen. Measurements. Normal ranges, nothing alarming. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so life-altering could look so abstract, just shadows and flickers, that required an expert to interpret. When the doctor entered, I barely looked at him at first. He greeted us, politely reviewed the chart, made a comment about timing and growth. Everything followed a script I had come to expect. That's why the shift in him was so jarring. One second, he was just another professional doing his job. The next, he was someone who had seen something he wished he hadn't. Standing in that hallway with him, the world felt tilted. People walked past us, nurses pushing carts, a couple laughing quietly as they passed, unaware that my entire sense of reality was being dismantled in real time. I wanted to grab the doctor by the arm and demand answers, but something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't dramatic. He was careful. That scared me more than any raised voice could have. Is this about the baby? I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. Not in the way you think. Then what are you saying? My voice came out sharper than I intended. I'm saying you need to protect yourself, he replied. And the safest first step is distance. Distance from my wife, I said. From the woman carrying my child, yes. I felt heat rush to my face, a mix of anger and disbelief. You can't just say something like that and walk away. I'm not walking away, he said. I'm telling you what I'm allowed to tell you right now. The rest? He paused. The rest you'll have to see for yourself. He opened the door back into the exam room, ending the conversation as abruptly as it had begun. My wife looked up immediately, concern creasing her brow. Everything okay? I forced a smile that felt stiff and foreign on my face. Yeah, I said. Just some paperwork questions. It was the first lie I told her without hesitation. As the appointment wrapped up, I barely heard the closing remarks. My attention was fixed on details that suddenly felt important in ways they hadn't before. The way my wife avoided my eyes for just a second longer than usual. The way the doctor kept his tone neutral, almost distant now, as if afraid that any extra word might betray him. I thanked him, shook his hand, and felt nothing but a cold knot forming in my stomach. We walked out into the afternoon light together. Cars passed. Someone honked. Life continued at a pace that felt offensive in its normality. My wife slipped her arm through mine, leaning into me as we crossed the parking lot. You're quiet, she said lightly. Everything really okay? I nodded. Just tired. It was true in a way. I felt exhausted already, as if I had been awake for days processing something my mind refused to fully grasp. The doctor's words replayed over and over, each time stripping away another layer of comfort. You are not safe. You need to get a divorce. You'll understand when you see this. See what? On the drive home, I said very little. I let her talk, filling the space with plans and small observations, and I answered when required. My hands stayed steady on the steering wheel, but inside something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer simply living my life. I was watching it as if from a slight distance, noting details I would have once ignored. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I understood one thing, with unsettling clarity. Whatever the doctor had seen, whatever truth was waiting for me, it was big enough to justify the destruction of everything I had built. And until I knew exactly what it was, I would say nothing. I would change nothing. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't ready to accuse. I was ready to pay attention. That day, in a quiet hallway outside an ultrasound room, I stopped being just a husband waiting for good news. I became something else entirely. By most standards, I had done everything right. I was the kind of man people described as steady, reliable, predictable in the best way. I built my career slowly, deliberately, refusing shortcuts that promised speed at the cost of sleep or integrity. I liked systems. I trusted patterns. When something worked, I refined it instead of replacing it. That mindset had shaped my professional life, my friendships, and eventually my marriage. People came to me when they needed a calm answer. Colleagues trusted me with decisions that carried weight. Family members assumed I would handle problems quietly without drama. I wore that reputation comfortably. It felt earned. I believed chaos happened to people who invited it. Before my current marriage, I had already learned what loss felt like. Years earlier, I had loved deeply and lost just as completely. It wasn't a scandal or a betrayal. It was the slow erosion that comes when life takes something away without explanation. I didn't collapse when it happened. I didn't spiral. I did what I had always done. I adjusted. I learned how to live with absence. My days became efficient, my evenings quiet. I filled my time with work routines and obligations that gave structure to the silence. Friends worried about me, but I reassured them I was fine, and in many ways, I was. I wasn't lonely in the dramatic sense. I simply moved through life without expecting much from it. That was the version of me she met. We didn't meet in a cinematic way. No sparks across a crowded room, no instant certainty. We met through a mutual connection during a conversation that felt unremarkable at the time. She listened more than she spoke. She didn't ask intrusive questions. She didn't push for closeness. That alone set her apart. She seemed grounded, self-contained, comfortable with silence. When I told her about my past, she didn't offer platitudes. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply acknowledged it as if grief were a fact of life rather than a flaw to be corrected. I found that deeply reassuring. Trust built slowly, intentionally. We spent months learning each other's habits, preferences, boundaries. There were no dramatic arguments, no emotional tests disguised as honesty. When disagreements arose, they were practical, resolved through conversation rather than tension. It felt adult, balanced. When we decided to marry, it wasn't because of a grand declaration. It was because the idea of continuing without her no longer made sense. Marriage felt like an extension of something already solid, not a leap into the unknown. Our life together reflected that same quiet order. Mornings were predictable, evenings were calm. We shared meals without distraction, conversations without subtext. I believed we had achieved what most people spent their lives chasing: stability without boredom, comfort without stagnation. The pregnancy only reinforced that belief. The news didn't arrive with tears or disbelief. It arrived with a sense of inevitability, as if this were the natural next chapter, rather than a sudden plot twist. I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table as she told me, noticing how steady my hands were, how quickly my mind shifted from surprise to planning. A child wasn't a disruption. It was a responsibility I was ready for. I imagined a future that was smaller in ambition, but larger in meaning. Less focus on expansion, more focus on preservation. I liked the symmetry of it. Build something, protect it, pass it on. Around us, people seemed to agree. Friends commented on how well we fit together. Family members spoke about how calm our home felt. Even strangers picked up on it, the absence of visible tension. I took pride in that. I thought it reflected good judgment. Looking back, I understand how dangerous that confidence was. There were moments, small ones, that didn't align perfectly. At the time, they registered as minor adjustments rather than warnings. A change in schedule here, a postponed conversation there, a decision made quickly without the usual discussion. None of it was alarming on its own. When I noticed, I explained it away. Life changes during pregnancy, I told myself. Priorities shift. Energy fluctuates. Not everything needs to be dissected. I had always believed that trust meant not auditing every detail. Love required a certain willingness to look forward rather than sideways. I held on to that belief tightly. Family gatherings continued as usual. Dinners filled with familiar voices, shared stories, predictable laughter. Everyone played their role. I watched the interactions without suspicion, satisfied that the ecosystem I had built was functioning as intended. There was comfort in that repetition. I remember one evening in particular, sitting back from the table and observing the scene as if from a distance. The lights were warm. The conversation flowed easily. My wife laughed at something trivial, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. I felt a quiet gratitude settle over me. This, I thought, is what surviving looks like. What I didn't recognize was how often I relied on normalcy as proof of safety. How quickly I equated calm with honesty. I didn't question things that didn't disrupt the surface, because I had trained myself to value composure above curiosity. It never occurred to me that someone could operate comfortably within that calm, while hiding something fundamental beneath it. When I think about that time now, what stands out isn't a single mistake or missed clue. It's the accumulation of assumptions. I assumed my experience made me harder to deceive. I assumed maturity reduced risk. I assumed that because I wasn't reckless, I couldn't be targeted. I believed betrayal announced itself loudly. It didn't. It arrived quietly, wearing the same face it always had. It lived inside routines I trusted and conversations I no longer examined. It thrived in my confidence that I had outgrown the need for vigilance. By the time the doctor pulled me aside in that hallway, the life I thought I had built was already standing on a fault line. I just hadn't felt the tremor yet. At the end of that chapter of my life, I still believed stability was something you could achieve once and then maintain through consistency alone. I didn't understand that stability, when left unquestioned, can become camouflage. And I had been living inside it for a very long time. The feeling didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, without a clear shape or name, like a low hum. You only notice when the room goes silent. At first I thought it was fatigue, the kind that comes from responsibility piling up from thinking too far ahead instead of staying in the moment. I told myself that anticipation could feel like anxiety if you let it. That was normal, manageable. But the feeling didn't leave. It followed me through the day, subtle but persistent. I would be halfway through a task and realize I'd been staring at nothing for several seconds, my mind circling the same thought without landing anywhere. At night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the familiar sounds of our house, cataloging them, as if I were somewhere unfamiliar. The refrigerator's soft click, the distant rush of traffic, her breathing beside me steady and even. Everything sounded the same. I was the one who felt different. The changes themselves were easy to explain. That was the problem. Her schedule shifted slightly, but pregnancy rearranges time. Appointments multiply, energy comes and goes. Some days she was talkative, animated, planning ahead. Other days she seemed inward, distracted, her thoughts elsewhere. I had read enough, listened enough to know that fluctuation was normal. So I adjusted with her. If she came home later than expected, I told myself she needed rest. If she rescheduled something we'd planned together, I assumed she was overwhelmed. When she stopped asking for my opinion on small decisions, I framed it as confidence, independence, a good sign. Each explanation fit neatly into the story I already believed. What unsettled me were the moments between explanations. The pauses where something almost surfaced and then slipped away. Conversations that ended too quickly, not with conflict, but with a gentle redirection. I would start to ask a question, feel it forming on my tongue, and then decide it wasn't worth interrupting the peace. Not everything needs to be examined, I reminded myself. She had always valued privacy, even in our closeness. We respected each other's boundaries. That respect had been one of the reasons our marriage felt so balanced. So when she began stepping into the next room to take calls or lowering her voice without explanation, I didn't accuse her in my mind. I noted it, then dismissed it. The phone became the easiest thing to notice and the hardest thing to interpret. It wasn't that she hid it. She didn't clutch it protectively or flinch when I entered the room. She simply treated it differently than before. The screen faced down more often. Notifications were cleared quickly. If it buzzed during dinner, she silenced it without checking, a small, efficient motion that suggested control rather than secrecy. I told myself it meant nothing. Still, the image stayed with me. The way her thumb moved with practiced ease. The way she would glance at the time afterward, as if measuring something invisible. It wasn't suspicious enough to confront. It was just unfamiliar enough to register. There were other moments too, small ones. A third presence in the room that I couldn't quite define. It wasn't a person, exactly, not yet. It was an awareness that something else was influencing the atmosphere of our home. Conversations seemed to orbit around topics we didn't name. Decisions were made elsewhere and delivered as conclusions rather than discussions. I felt slightly out of sync, as if I had missed a meeting everyone else attended. When I noticed it, I felt embarrassed by the thought. Marriage isn't a boardroom, I told myself. Not everything requires consensus. She was allowed to have parts of her life that didn't revolve around me. And yet, there was one evening when the feeling sharpened briefly into something almost tangible. We were sitting at the kitchen counter, the house quiet except for the ticking clock above the sink. She mentioned an upcoming appointment, something she hadn't brought up before. The timing didn't quite align with what I remembered, but I couldn't be sure. I opened my mouth to ask for clarification. She met my eyes and smiled, already moving on, already filling the space with another detail. The moment passed. I closed my mouth and nodded, annoyed with myself for hesitating. Why hadn't I asked? The answer was uncomfortable, because I didn't want to hear an answer that might require a response, because asking would mean acknowledging that I was unsure. And uncertainty felt like a personal failure, a crack in the competence I prided myself on. So I explained it away, as I had everything else. I told myself that this was what adulthood looked like. That comfort didn't mean constant transparency. That trusting someone meant allowing them room to move without supervision. I had always believed that suspicion was corrosive, that it poisoned relationships faster than any hidden truth ever could. That belief had guided me well for years. It had kept my life clean, orderly, free of unnecessary conflict. Now, it kept me quiet. I began to notice how often I chose silence over curiosity. How instinctively I smoothed over moments of confusion. Each time I did, the hum grew slightly louder, though still not loud enough to force action. It lived in the background, persistent, patient. One night, long after she had fallen asleep, I stood alone in the living room, lights off, looking out at the darkened street. I tried to pinpoint when the feeling had started, to trace it back to a specific moment. I couldn't. It had no origin point. It was an accumulation built from dozens of moments I had deemed too small to matter. I wondered briefly if this was what intuition felt like. Not a warning siren, but a quiet refusal to be ignored. The thought unsettled me, and I pushed it aside. The next day unfolded without incident. We spoke easily. We moved through our routines with practiced coordination. If anyone had been watching us, they would have seen nothing unusual. I made a point of being attentive, of staying engaged, of reaffirming normalcy through action. Normalcy, I was learning, could be performed. As days passed, the feeling didn't intensify, but it didn't fade either. It settled into me, a constant companion I pretended not to notice. I began paying closer attention without admitting that I was doing so. Listening more carefully, remembering details, noting inconsistencies without labeling them as such. I didn't accuse, I didn't confront. I observed. That shift was small, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. It changed the way I moved through my own life. I was still a husband, still a partner, still preparing for fatherhood. But alongside those roles, another one had quietly emerged. I was watching. At the time, I didn't see that as a betrayal of trust. I saw it as prudence, a reasonable adjustment in response to an undefined discomfort. I believed I could maintain both at once, that observation didn't require action. I was wrong about that too. Because once you begin paying attention, truly paying attention, you can't unknow what you notice. The mind starts connecting dots on its own, whether you invite it to or not. And even when the picture remains incomplete, the absence of clarity becomes its own form of information. By the end of that week, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. The calm I had been living in wasn't evidence that everything was fine. It was simply the absence of noise. And silence, I was beginning to realize, could hide almost anything. Something went wrong with me in a way that didn't announce itself as a crisis. It began as a thinning of focus, a strange delay between thought and action. I would reach for my keys and pause, unsure why my hand was hovering in midair. I would read the same paragraph twice without absorbing a word. It wasn't dizziness or pain, nothing dramatic enough to justify alarm. It was more like the edges of my attention had softened, as if the world had been wrapped in a layer of cotton. I blamed sleep at first, then stress, then the kind of mental overload that comes from carrying responsibility quietly for too long. I told myself that anticipation could be exhausting, that preparing for a child rearranges your priorities whether you notice it or not. Still, the feeling lingered. There were moments when I felt slightly out of sync with my own body, as though I were a fraction of a second behind myself. I would finish a sentence and realize I had no memory of starting it. Once driving home on a familiar route, I missed my turn and didn't realize it until I was several blocks past it. That had never happened to me before. I didn't panic. I adjusted. When it happened again, I scheduled an appointment I hadn't planned to make. I told myself it was routine, a precaution. There was no urgency in the call, no fear in my voice. I chose a professional I trusted, someone adjacent enough to my life to understand context, but distant enough to remain objective. The meeting was brief, almost anticlimactic. I sat across from him in a quiet office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He asked about my sleep, my workload, my routine. I answered honestly, downplaying nothing but emphasizing nothing either. He listened, nodded, made notes. His demeanor was calm, reassuring, familiar. When I finished describing the fogginess, the lapses, he leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. "That sounds like transition stress," he said. "You're adjusting to a major life change." I felt a wash of relief I hadn't known I was holding back. "So nothing serious?" "Nothing alarming," he replied. "Your mind is recalibrating, it happens. Especially to people who like control." He said it kindly, without judgment. I recognized myself in the description and accepted it easily. Of course, this made sense. I was preparing to become a father. My routines were shifting. The explanation fit neatly into the framework I already trusted. We talked for a few more minutes, mostly about coping strategies. Rest, patience, avoid overanalyzing every sensation. I agreed with all of it. I was ready to leave with my reassurance neatly folded in my pocket. As I stood, he hesitated. It was subtle, barely a pause, but enough to register. He closed his notebook, then opened it again, as if reconsidering whether to add something. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Not alarmed, thoughtful. "There's one thing," he said. I waited. "If anything at home feels off," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "Don't ignore it just because it's inconvenient to examine." I blinked, surprised by the direction of the comment. "You mean stressors? I mean patterns," he said. "People often assume discomfort comes from inside themselves. Sometimes it doesn't." He didn't elaborate. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He simply held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded, signaling the conversation was over. I left his office unsettled in a way I couldn't immediately justify. The advice was vague, almost generic. It wasn't an accusation or even a warning in the conventional sense. And yet it lodged itself in my mind with uncomfortable persistence. I replayed the sentence as I drove home, testing it against my circumstances, then rejecting the comparison. Nothing at home felt off, I told myself. Not really. When I walked through the door, everything looked exactly as it should have. The familiar layout, the soft light from the kitchen, the quiet rhythm of a normal afternoon. My wife greeted me with an easy smile, asked how the appointment went. I told her it was nothing, that I was just tired. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to what she had been doing. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching her move through the room with practiced ease. There was nothing suspicious in her behavior, nothing I could point to. And yet the words echoed again. If anything at home feels off. I dismissed the thought. That evening passed without incident. We ate dinner, talked about plans, laughed at something trivial. The fog lifted slightly, or perhaps I simply stopped noticing it. Either way, I slept deeply convinced I had overthought the entire episode. The next day, the warning resurfaced. It happened in a moment so small, I might have missed it entirely under different circumstances. We were discussing logistics for the coming week, our schedules overlapping in the way they often did. She mentioned an appointment I didn't recognize placed at a time I was fairly sure had already been accounted for. I frowned just slightly. I thought that was Thursday. She paused, then shook her head. No, it was always Wednesday. The correction was gentle, unbothered. But something in her tone was final closed. The conversation moved on immediately, as if the discrepancy had never existed. I stood there replaying the exchange in my mind. I was almost certain about what I remembered. Almost. But certainty requires evidence, and I had none. So I let it go. Later alone, I thought about the pause in her response, the way she hadn't questioned my confusion or sought clarification. She had simply corrected me and continued. It was efficient, confident. It was also exactly the kind of thing I would have dismissed before. The realization that the warning hadn't come from nowhere unsettled me more than the warning itself. Someone outside my marriage had noticed something, however faint, not enough to accuse, not enough to intervene, just enough to suggest awareness. That meant the unease wasn't entirely mine. I didn't act on that realization. I didn't confront anyone or ask probing questions. I continued as I had before, maintaining the surface of normalcy that had always served me so well. But internally, something shifted. I began to separate reassurance from truth. The calm explanations I had accepted so readily now felt provisional, like placeholders waiting to be replaced. I didn't reject them outright. I simply stopped relying on them as absolutes. When I felt off, I no longer assumed the cause lay solely within me. That distinction mattered. As the days passed, the fog came and went. Never severe enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to remain noticeable. Each time it did, I thought of that office, that pause, that carefully phrased sentence. It wasn't fear that grew inside me. It was alertness. I started to understand that warnings don't always arrive with urgency. Sometimes they arrive softly wrapped in professionalism and plausible explanations easy to ignore if you're committed to believing everything is fine. By the end of that week, I hadn't uncovered any new truths. I hadn't gathered evidence or drawn conclusions. But something fundamental had changed all the same. For the first time, the doubt I felt wasn't isolated. It had been acknowledged, however indirectly, by someone outside my own head. That made it harder to dismiss and impossible to unhear. I went to bed that night knowing one thing for certain. Whatever was happening, whatever I was sensing, it wasn't just noise. It was a signal. And whether I chose to listen or not, it had already been sent. I didn't start looking for proof. I started looking for consistency. It felt like a reasonable boundary to set for myself. I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't preparing a confrontation. I simply wanted to understand whether the small dissonances I'd noticed were isolated or part of a pattern. Patterns, after all, were something I trusted. They had guided every successful decision I'd ever made. So I watched. I paid attention to timing first because timing is difficult to fake over long periods. When things happen once, they can be explained away. When they happen repeatedly, they leave a shape. I noted when she left the house and when she returned, not obsessively, not with a stopwatch, just with the quiet awareness of someone who knows his own routines well enough to recognize deviations. Most days aligned, some didn't. On those days, the explanations were smooth, delivered without hesitation. Traffic, an appointment running long, a last-minute errand she'd forgotten to mention, all plausible, all reasonable, and all delivered with the same calm tone as if she were reciting facts rather than justifying them. That calm should have reassured me. Instead, it made me uneasy. I began to realize how rarely she appeared uncertain anymore. In the past, we'd talked through things together, adjusted plans collaboratively. Now, decisions arrived fully formed. There was no space left for negotiation, no shared confusion. It was efficient, streamlined, and subtly exclusionary. I told myself I was overthinking again. The phone came back into focus, without my intending it to. I didn't touch it. I didn't check it. I simply noticed how often it wasn't where I expected it to be. In the past, it lived on the counter or the coffee table charging in plain sight. Now it traveled with her more deliberately, always within reach. Not hidden, just managed. When messages arrived, she didn't jump to respond. She waited. That more than anything else struck me as intentional. Waiting implies prioritization. It implies awareness of being observed. One evening, we were sitting together on the couch, the television murmuring quietly in the background. Her phone vibrated once on the armrest between us. She glanced at it, then flipped it face down without checking. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. She nodded. "Just noise." The word lingered in my mind long after the moment passed. Noise. As if whatever was trying to reach her didn't warrant acknowledgement in that space at that time. As if she had already decided when and where it would matter. I didn't press. I had learned by then how easily pressing could turn curiosity into conflict. And I wasn't ready for conflict. I wanted clarity, not drama. The first concrete inconsistency appeared 2 days later, and it was almost laughably mundane. I was organizing paperwork at my desk, sorting through mail and documents I'd been neglecting. It was busy work, the kind that gives your hands something to do while your mind drifts. I came across a receipt folded neatly inside an envelope that didn't match its contents. A small thing. A gas station charge from across town, time-stamped at an hour I knew she'd told me she was elsewhere. I stared at it longer than necessary. There were explanations, of course. She could have gone there earlier and paid later. The receipt could have been misfiled. I could be misremembering. Memory is unreliable under stress, I reminded myself. I had already been warned about that. Still, I didn't throw it away. I placed it back where I'd found it and made a mental note, not a conclusion. Just a marker. A single dot on an otherwise blank page. Over the next few days, a few more dots appeared. A calendar entry that didn't match a conversation we'd had. A casual reference to a meeting I didn't recall being mentioned before. None of it was dramatic enough to justify alarm, but together they formed something recognizable. A pattern. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a strange heaviness, the kind that settles in your chest when you know you're standing at the edge of something you can't step away from once you cross it. I had spent my life believing that knowledge was power. I was beginning to understand that knowledge also carries responsibility. Once you see a pattern, you can't pretend it isn't there. I tested myself next. I wanted to know whether my observations were influencing my behavior, whether I was projecting suspicion where none belonged. So I deliberately relaxed my attention for a day. I engaged fully. I laughed more. I asked fewer questions. I let the rhythm of normalcy carry me along. The discomfort didn't disappear. It sharpened. It became clear that my awareness wasn't creating the inconsistencies. It was simply revealing them. That night, lying awake beside her, I tried to imagine confronting her directly. I pictured the conversation the way it might unfold. The confusion on her face. The hurt. The possibility that I was wrong, that I would damage something precious based on misinterpretation. The risk felt enormous. But another thought crept in quieter and more unsettling. What if I was right? What if silence wasn't preserving peace, but enabling something to continue unchecked? I didn't like either option. The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. It wasn't an object or a schedule discrepancy. It was a shift in her attention. She watched me more closely now, her eyes lingering when she thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't suspicion. It was assessment. That was when I understood that observation wasn't one-sided anymore. She sensed a change even if she didn't know its cause. That meant time mattered. Whatever clarity I was moving toward, I couldn't drift there indefinitely. Awareness without direction is dangerous. It invites mistakes. I needed information that didn't rely on interpretation. The decision to take a small, deliberate step felt heavier than it should have. I told myself it wasn't surveillance. It wasn't betrayal. It was verification. The difference mattered to me even if it was semantic. I checked something I had never checked before. The result didn't answer every question. It didn't reveal a dramatic truth or a hidden life laid bare. What it did was confirm that my assumptions about transparency were outdated. There were gaps. I couldn't explain away overlaps that shouldn't have existed. Enough to know that something was being coordinated without me. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, hands resting uselessly on the desk. I felt no anger, no rush of adrenaline, just a steady, sinking certainty that the life I thought I was sharing was no longer entirely shared. That realization changed how I moved through the next few days. I became careful in a way I hadn't been before. Not guarded, but intentional. I chose my words more deliberately. I controlled my expressions. I kept my reactions measured. If she was watching me, she wouldn't see panic. She wouldn't see accusation. She would see exactly what she expected to see. Normal. Inside, though, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to preserve the illusion of harmony at all costs. I was trying to understand the rules of a game I hadn't known I was playing. By the end of that week, I accepted a truth I couldn't avoid any longer. Trust once fractured doesn't shatter loudly. It thins. It stretches. It becomes something fragile that requires constant reinforcement. And I was no longer certain who was responsible for reinforcing it. The dots were there now. Enough of them to suggest direction, even if the picture remained incomplete. I didn't know where the path would lead, only that continuing to ignore it would mean choosing ignorance over responsibility. For the first time since the ultrasound appointment, I stopped telling myself that everything would resolve on its own. Some things only resolve when you're willing to follow them all the way to the end. I didn't intend to involve anyone else. That had been my rule from the beginning, even before I admitted to myself that something was wrong. I believe that once you brought another person into a situation like this, you lost control of it. Words spread. Interpretations multiplied. Motives became questionable. Silence, for all its weight, was still something I could manage alone. But there is a point where solitude stops being strength and starts becoming risk. The first sign that I was approaching that point came in the form of a decision I couldn't verify by myself. I had gathered enough fragments to know there was coordination happening without me, but not enough to understand its scope or intent. I could feel the outline of something larger, but outlines are dangerous. They invite imagination to fill in gaps, and imagination is rarely neutral. I needed perspective that wasn't clouded by proximity. The person I chose wasn't obvious. It wasn't a close friend or someone who owed me loyalty by default. I avoided anyone emotionally invested in preserving my marriage, anyone who might reflexively defend what they didn't want to lose. I also avoided professionals whose involvement would formalize the situation too quickly. I chose someone who existed just outside the center of my life. Someone observant. Someone who had no reason to dramatize or minimize what I was seeing. Reaching out felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. We met in a place that didn't invite attention, somewhere neutral and unremarkable. The kind of place where conversations blended into background noise and no one remembered faces afterward. I arrived early, sat with my back to the wall, and waited. When they arrived, they looked at me with mild curiosity, not concern. That alone told me I'd chosen correctly. They didn't assume crisis. They assumed conversation. I didn't start with accusations or conclusions. I described behaviors, timelines, small inconsistencies. I spoke carefully, sticking to what I could verify rather than what I felt. I left out the emotional context entirely. They listened without interrupting eyes, focused posture, relaxed. When I finished, they didn't respond immediately. They took a moment, as if aligning what I'd said with something already in their mind. "Can I ask you something?" they said. "Of course." "Have you noticed changes in how information reaches you?" they asked. "Not just what's happening, but how you're told about it." The question landed harder than I expected. "Yes," I said after a pause. "It feels curated." They nodded once. "That's what I thought." "What did you think?" I asked. "That you're not imagining this," they said. "But you're also not seeing all of it yet." The statement was calm, measured. Not alarming, but it carried weight. It suggested a middle ground I hadn't allowed myself to consider. That I wasn't wrong, but I wasn't fully informed either. They asked a few more questions, specific ones. Dates, frequency, whether certain events overlapped with others. As I answered, I watched their expression shift slightly, not with shock, but with recognition. "I've seen this before," they said finally. "In what context?" I asked. "People don't always hide things because they're malicious," they replied. "Sometimes they hide things because they believe they're managing outcomes, controlling variables, especially when they think the truth would destabilize someone." I thought of the fog in my head, the reassurance, the explanations that arrived before questions were fully formed. Managing outcomes. I repeated. "Yes," they said. "The problem is management without consent is manipulation, whether it's well-intentioned or not." That distinction settled something inside me. I hadn't wanted to label what was happening. Labels felt extreme. But the absence of a name hadn't made it less real. It had just made it harder to address. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted. "That's because you're still thinking in terms of resolution," they said. "You're not there yet." "Where am I then?" "Preparation." They leaned back slightly, creating space rather than closing it. "You don't act on this. Not now. You gather. Quietly. You watch how information moves, not just where it goes, and you protect yourself in the meantime." "Protect how?" I asked. "By not tipping your hand," they said, "and by making sure you're not dependent on anyone else's version of reality." The phrase stayed with me long after the conversation ended. We parted without drama, without any formal agreement. They didn't promise to help me. I didn't ask them to. The value of the meeting wasn't in alliance. It was in validation and orientation. I left with direction, not answers. Over the next few days, I noticed how that direction subtly altered my behavior. I stopped filling in gaps with assumptions. When something didn't make sense, I noted it and moved on, rather than forcing coherence. I resisted the urge to resolve tension prematurely. I also began to recognize something else, something more unsettling. The fog wasn't constant anymore. It fluctuated. There were days when I felt sharper, clearer, more present than I had in weeks. And there were days when the heaviness returned, pressing in behind my eyes, slowing my thoughts just enough to be inconvenient, but not enough to incapacitate. The inconsistency bothered me. I tracked it quietly, not obsessively, just enough to notice a pattern emerging. The fog appeared more often after certain routines, certain shared moments, certain gestures I had previously interpreted as care. I didn't jump to conclusions. I remembered what I'd been told. "You're not seeing all of it yet." Still, the awareness shifted from abstract unease to something closer to concern. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, she offered me something small and ordinary, a gesture that would have gone unnoticed before. I accepted it out of habit, then paused, the object resting in my hand. She watched me, expression neutral. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just distracted." The moment passed. But something in me had crossed another threshold, not into panic, but into caution. Later that night, lying awake, I replayed the conversation with the person I'd met. The way they hadn't rushed me. The way they'd framed my role not as victim or detective, but as someone preparing for a truth that hadn't fully surfaced yet. Preparation implies patience. It also implies restraint. I realized then that I had been thinking about this situation as something to solve when in reality it was something to survive first. Survival required clarity, yes, but it also required timing. Whatever was happening wasn't static. It was ongoing. And if it was ongoing, then acting too soon could make it worse, not better. I wasn't ready to confront. I wasn't ready to accuse. I wasn't even ready to name what I suspected. What I was ready to do was stop being passive. By the end of that week, I had quietly restructured my internal priorities. Normalcy was no longer my goal. Awareness was. Safety was. Control not over others, but over my own responses. I had involved someone else, and it hadn't weakened me the way I'd feared. It had clarified the terrain. It had reminded me that silence isn't neutral when it's imposed, and trust isn't intact just because it hasn't been openly broken. I went to bed that night understanding something essential. Whatever truth was moving toward me, it wasn't going to arrive gently. And when it did, I needed to be ready to recognize it, not through fear or assumption, but through facts I had chosen to see for myself. The days after that conversation felt heavier, not because anything outwardly changed, but because I was now aware of how much effort it took to keep things the same. Every interaction required calibration. Every response needed to be measured, not for honesty, but for impact. I had learned to control rooms with numbers and negotiations, but this was different. This was control through restraint, through choosing what not to reveal. I became acutely aware of my own face. I practiced neutrality without meaning to. In the mirror while shaving. In the car before pulling into the driveway. I trained my expressions the way some people train their voices, smoothing out reactions before they could surface. Surprise softened into curiosity. Concern flattened into fatigue. Nothing sharp, nothing memorable. Normal had become camouflage. Our routines continued, but I experienced them differently now. Breakfast conversations that once felt easy began to feel rehearsed. We talked about harmless things, weather, groceries, nursery colors. I nodded at the right moments, asked the expected questions, laughed softly when it was appropriate. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I was cataloging everything. I noticed how often she anticipated my questions before I asked them, offering explanations unprompted. I noticed how frequently she steered conversations away from specifics and toward generalities. When I pushed gently for details, she provided them, but always just enough. Never too much. It wasn't avoidance, it was management. There was a subtle confidence in it that unsettled me. She wasn't scrambling or defensive. She was comfortable enough to believe she was still ahead of whatever game was unfolding. That confidence told me more than any contradiction could have. The alliance I had formed sat quietly in the background of my thoughts. We didn't communicate often, and when we did, it was brief. Observations, not theories. Confirmations, not conclusions. The distance was intentional. Too much contact would create dependency. Too little would leave me isolated. It was a narrow line to walk. One afternoon, I received a message that tightened that line further. A short update. No context. Just enough to confirm that something I'd suspected wasn't imagined. A timeline that aligned too neatly. A behavior that matched a pattern I hadn't named aloud. I read it twice, then locked my phone and sat still. This was the point I'd been preparing for, without fully acknowledging it. The moment when observation edged closer to implication. Not proof, not yet, but proximity. The knowledge didn't bring clarity. It brought pressure. Pressure to act. Pressure to protect. Pressure to decide how much I was willing to risk by knowing more. That evening, the strain surfaced in an unexpected way. We were standing in the kitchen, the air filled with the sound of something simmering on the stove. She handed me a glass of water without comment, the gesture automatic, familiar. I took it, then paused. The pause was barely perceptible, but it was there, a fraction of a second longer than usual. long enough for her to notice. She tilted her head slightly. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, meeting her eyes. "Just tired." She studied my face for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, easy and reassuring. "You've been saying that a lot." I shrugged. "It's been a lot." She accepted that, or appeared to. The conversation moved on. But the air between us felt different afterward. Thinner, more alert. That night I lay awake replaying the moment. Not because of the glass of water itself, but because of her reaction. She had noticed the hesitation. That meant she was watching for it. Awareness had become mutual. The next few days required even more discipline. I avoided anything that might provoke curiosity or concern. I didn't change my schedule abruptly. I didn't withdraw. I didn't push. I existed in the narrow space between engagement and detachment. It was exhausting. The alliance felt the strain as well. A brief exchange revealed a disagreement we hadn't anticipated. Not about facts, but about pace. They believed time was compressing faster than I realized, that whatever was being set in motion wouldn't wait for my comfort. I believed the opposite, that acting too soon would expose me without protecting anyone. We didn't argue. We acknowledged the difference and adjusted our expectations. Cooperation doesn't require agreement, only alignment. And alignment, I realized, was temporary by nature. Trusting someone under pressure is different from trusting them in calm. You don't look for reassurance. You look for consistency. I tested that consistency quietly. When I shared an observation, they responded with verification or restraint, never escalation. When I withheld something, they didn't push. The boundaries held. That mattered. Meanwhile, the information I was collecting continued to accumulate. Not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments. Small confirmations, repeated behaviors, a narrowing range of explanations. The picture wasn't complete, but its edges were sharpening. I began to understand that the danger wasn't just in what I didn't know. It was in what others believed I didn't know. That gap created leverage, and leverage once assumed invites risk-taking. I watched her take those risks, not recklessly, carefully. Small adjustments that suggested confidence in outcomes she believed she controlled. Each one confirmed that whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It was planned. That realization stripped away my last illusions. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation. It wasn't a moment of confusion or misplaced trust. It was a structure that had been built gradually, intentionally, and without my consent. Understanding that changed how I viewed my role. I wasn't trying to uncover a truth to confront it. I was trying to survive long enough to choose how and when that truth would surface. The distinction mattered. There was one moment near the end of that week when I almost broke. We were sitting together quietly, the house dim except for a single lamp. She leaned against me, her weight familiar grounding. For a brief second, the old comfort surfaced. The instinct to protect, to ignore everything else and hold on to what felt real. The urge was powerful. Then I remembered the patterns, the management, the risks taken under the assumption of my ignorance, the way comfort had been used as cover. The urge passed. I placed my hand over hers, returned the gesture, and kept my face still. That was the cost of knowing what you can't yet reveal. You carry it alone, even when you're not physically alone. You perform closeness while guarding distance. You become both participant and observer in your own life. By the end of that chapter, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence isn't passive. It's active restraint. And restraint, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of power. I didn't know exactly how or when the truth would surface. I only knew that when it did, it would not be on anyone else's terms. Until then, I would hold the line, even if holding it meant standing perfectly still while everything around me shifted. I hadn't planned to ask for help, but by then it was clear that staying alone with the truth was becoming its own kind of risk. The decision came to me slowly, not as a moment of desperation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of limits. There were things I could observe, patterns I could track, but there were also gaps I couldn't safely cross on my own. And the longer I waited, the more those gaps felt intentional, placed there to isolate me. The person I reached out to wasn't someone I trusted easily. In fact, that was part of the reason I chose them. We had history but not closeness, respect but not warmth. They knew me well enough to understand my instincts and far enough away to challenge them. As soon as I sent the message, I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. There are some conversations you can't take back once they begin. Some lines, once crossed permanently, redraw the map. We met in a place that discouraged sentiment, neutral, forgettable, busy enough to blend into. When they arrived, their expression told me they sensed the seriousness without needing explanation. They didn't ask why. They asked where I wanted to start. I didn't tell them everything, not even close. I chose my words carefully, laying out facts without framing them as conclusions. Timelines, behaviors, moments that didn't align. I spoke as if I were presenting a problem to be solved, not a betrayal to be confessed. They listened without interrupting, their face unreadable. When I finished, they leaned back slightly and exhaled. I was wondering when you'd say something, they said. That caught me off guard. You noticed, I asked. I noticed changes, they replied, not details, shifts. You don't drift without reason. They didn't accuse anyone. They didn't speculate wildly. Instead, they shared something I hadn't expected, their own unease. A moment from the past, a conversation they'd dismissed at the time because it hadn't been their place to question it. A detail that hadn't made sense then but did now. Hearing it reframed everything. This wasn't just my perspective. It wasn't paranoia or overanalysis. There were echoes, overlaps, places where our observations intersected without coordination. That convergence made the situation heavier and more real. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to create something that wasn't there, they said. But now that you're here, I think it is there. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the implications settle. The alliance formed not with a dramatic handshake or declaration, but with mutual restraint. Neither of us wanted escalation. We wanted understanding. They agreed to help, but on conditions. No rash actions, no confrontations, no sharing information that hadn't been verified. And most importantly, no emotional decisions. This wasn't about vindication or justice yet. It was about preventing damage. I agreed without hesitation. The first thing they offered wasn't explosive or shocking. It was something small and precise. A piece of information that aligned too well with what I had already observed to be coincidence. It didn't answer every question, but it confirmed direction. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only gravity. With that gravity came a new awareness of cost. Bringing someone else into this meant multiplying risk. It meant someone else could be hurt, misled, or targeted if things went wrong. That responsibility sat heavier on me than any fear I had felt for myself. Once someone else knows, silence becomes heavier. From that point on, my days took on a different texture. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was preparing, quietly, methodically. I kept lists. I never wrote down, rehearsed responses I hoped I wouldn't need, and measured time in terms of proximity rather than distance. I began to anticipate her movements, not to follow them, but to avoid collisions, to make sure my own actions didn't create unnecessary variables. If this was a game I didn't want to reveal, I'd learned the rules too early. The alliance remained cautious. We spoke infrequently and indirectly, sharing only what mattered. There was no comfort in it, no reassurance, just alignment. And alignment, I was learning, is often colder than trust. At home, nothing outwardly changed. That was the most difficult part. The intimacy continued familiar and convincing. We shared meals, exchanged small jokes, planned for the future. The performance required precision. I wondered sometimes if she sensed the shift, if she felt the distance I was holding just beneath the surface. If she did, she didn't acknowledge it. Or perhaps she did, and simply adjusted the way she always had. That adaptability was no longer reassuring. It was evidence. Late one night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I stood alone in the kitchen and considered how far things had moved without appearing to move at all. I had started this journey thinking I needed answers. What I had learned instead was that answers are rarely what keep you safe. Preparation does. By the end of that chapter, I accepted a truth I hadn't wanted to face. I wasn't choosing whether to trust someone anymore. I was choosing whether to be alone with what I knew or share the weight strategically. I didn't trust my ally because it felt right. I trusted them because I couldn't afford to be alone anymore. And once that choice was made, there was no going back to observation alone. Everything that followed would be shaped by the fact that the truth was no longer mine to carry in isolation. I learned quickly that pretending nothing was wrong required more discipline than confronting the truth ever would have. Every day became an exercise in restraint. I woke up already aware of my expressions, my tone, the cadence of my voice. I measured reactions before they reached my face, filtered thoughts before they became words. I had always believed self-control was a strength. Now it felt like a fragile balancing act, one misstep away from collapse. The house looked the same. That was the most disorienting part. Sunlight still fell across the kitchen floor in the mornings. The clock above the sink still ticked with the same quiet insistence. The familiar rhythms continued uninterrupted, as if the environment itself refused to acknowledge the tension threading through it. I moved through those rhythms carefully. Breakfast conversations stayed light. Plans were discussed without depth, future-oriented enough to sound sincere, but vague enough to avoid commitment. I asked questions that didn't lead anywhere, nodded at answers that felt rehearsed, and let silence settle when it threatened to expose too much. Normalcy had become a strategy. At times, the performance felt almost convincing. There were moments when I caught myself relaxing, when laughter came easily, and the weight lifted just enough to make me question my own vigilance. Those moments frightened me more than the tension did. Comfort was dangerous now. It tempted me to forget why I was being careful in the first place. I paid for those lapses later in the quiet hours. Late at night when the house slept, my mind refused to. I replayed conversations not searching for hidden meanings, but for consistency. I examined what had been said against what had been done, looking for alignment. Sometimes I found it. Often I didn't. The absence of alignment wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, persistent, like a door that never quite closed all the way. Enough to let in doubt, not enough to force confrontation. I became aware of how closely she watched me. It wasn't obvious at first. Just a slight increase in attention. A question asked a second time. A pause where there hadn't been one before. Eye contact held just a beat longer, as if waiting for something to slip. I realized then that my restraint had not gone unnoticed. The awareness changed the dynamic between us. The space felt charged, though neither of us acknowledged it. We moved around each other with careful politeness, like people sharing a narrow bridge from opposite ends. There was no aggression, no accusation, just mutual assessment. One afternoon, she tested me. The test arrived disguised as a simple request, something she hadn't asked for in a long time. The timing was wrong. The details felt unnecessary. It was the kind of thing that invited a reaction more than it required compliance. I responded calmly, agreeing without enthusiasm, asking one neutral, clarifying question. I made sure my tone was even, my posture relaxed. I offered nothing extra. She watched my face as I spoke, then smiled, satisfied. I understood then that the test hadn't been about the request itself. It had been about my response. She was measuring deviation, looking for cracks. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't just hiding awareness anymore. I was being evaluated for it. That night I reached out to my ally. The communication was brief and deliberate. No context, no emotional framing, just a single update and a question about timing. The reply came later than usual, which unsettled me more than if it hadn't come at all. When it did, it wasn't reassuring. Something had shifted. Information they'd been tracking now suggested acceleration. Plans tightening, variables being reduced. Whatever structure existed beneath the surface was moving closer to activation. The pressure increased immediately. I could feel time compressing, days shrinking around me. The margin for error narrowed. Every choice carried more weight because every choice now existed within a countdown I couldn't see clearly. My ally and I disagreed quietly but firmly. They believed it was time to prepare for exposure, to start positioning pieces, sorties in anticipation of a break. I believed it was still too soon. That exposure without full clarity would create chaos without resolution. That acting prematurely could destroy the very leverage we needed. Neither of us was wrong. That was the problem. We ended the exchange without consensus, agreeing only to continue observing and avoid forcing outcomes. Cooperation held, but it felt thinner now, stretched by urgency. At home, the strain manifested in unexpected ways. I found myself craving isolation, even while maintaining closeness. I took longer walks, spent extra minutes in the car before coming inside. Not to avoid her, but to prepare myself for the performance required once I crossed the threshold. One evening, while we were sitting together, she mentioned an upcoming plan that extended further into the future than usual. It was casual, almost hopeful, a detail about something months away. The mention stopped me cold. I nodded, responded appropriately, but inside my mind raced. Future planning implies confidence. Confidence implies belief in continuity. That belief, I realized, wasn't something I shared anymore. The gap between our assumptions felt vast. Later alone, I tried to imagine what she believed would happen next. How she saw the weeks unfolding. Whether she believed I would remain compliant, unaware, predictable. The thought unsettled me because it suggested an asymmetry of expectation. I wasn't living in the same version of the future she was. The physical toll of maintaining composure began to surface. My body reacted in ways my mind tried to ignore. Tension settled into my shoulders. Sleep came in fragments. My jaw ached from holding itself too still. I learned how to breathe without showing it. There were moments when the urge to confront became overwhelming. When the temptation to break the silence and force clarity pressed hard against my restraint. In those moments, I reminded myself of the tests, the evaluations, the sense of acceleration. Confrontation wouldn't bring honesty. It would trigger containment. Containment favors the prepared. I wasn't prepared enough yet. The event that finally pushed everything closer to the edge arrived without fanfare. A gathering. Ordinary on the surface. Planned long before the tension had a name. It should have been harmless. Instead, it felt like a rehearsal for something larger. I watched interactions, carefully noting who spoke to whom, how information traveled, where attention lingered. Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before, subtle alignments that confirmed my growing suspicion that the structure extended beyond just the two of us. That realization changed the stakes. This wasn't simply a personal reckoning. It was a system. And systems don't unravel quietly. By the end of that night, my decision solidified. I would hold the line a little longer, but not indefinitely. I would allow the system to reveal itself further, to expose its own contours through movement rather than accusation. Timing, I understood now, wasn't about patience. It was about precision. As I went to bed in the early hours, the house silent around me, I accepted the cost of what I was doing. Maintaining the facade was draining, corrosive, isolating. But breaking it too soon would cost more. I wasn't waiting for courage. I was waiting for the moment when silence would stop protecting me and start protecting something else. The night I had been counting down to arrived without ceremony. There was no thunder, no dramatic shift in the air. Nothing to mark it as different from any other evening. that more than anything unsettled me. I had expected some internal signal, a surge of certainty or dread. Instead, I felt calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes not from confidence, but from emotional exhaustion. This was the night I believed the truth would finally surface. The event itself was unremarkable on paper. A public gathering tied to obligations we couldn't easily avoid. Familiar faces. Predictable conversations. A setting that felt neutral enough to be safe, structured enough to observe. It aligned perfectly with the timelines I had been tracking, the quiet countdown my ally and I had both noticed tightening over the past week. If something was going to happen, I believed it would happen here. As we prepared to leave, I watched her closely. Not for guilt or fear, but for certainty. People who believe they are in control carry themselves differently. There's an ease to their movements, a lack of hesitation. She had that ease. She moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, checking details, adjusting plans, confident in outcomes she didn't explain. That confidence hardened my resolve. On the drive, we spoke lightly. She mentioned something inconsequential, and I responded automatically. My mind was elsewhere, rehearsing possibilities. If this happened, then that. If not, wait. I had mapped the evening in advance, tracing potential branches and choosing where I would step in if the moment presented itself. Everything seemed to align. When we arrived, the atmosphere was exactly as expected. People mingled, exchanged pleasantries, laughed at jokes that required no real attention. I scanned the room without appearing to letting my gaze drift naturally while cataloging movement. Nothing stood out at first. That was a good sign. Obvious signals would have meant panic or miscalculation. I stayed present. I stayed patient. At one point, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that told me I was close. Not to certainty, but to action. A conversation nearby brushed against a detail I had been tracking. A reference made too casually, too confidently. It was small, but it confirmed something I'd suspected about coordination. I could act now, I thought. The impulse was strong, almost physical. I imagined stepping forward, asking the question I had rehearsed 100 times. I imagined the room pausing attention, shifting, the first crack appearing in the carefully maintained surface. For a moment, I was sure this was it. Then the variable I hadn't accounted for entered the equation. It wasn't dramatic, no confrontation, no interruption. Just a subtle shift in the environment that changed the flow of information. Someone arrived unexpectedly. Someone whose presence altered the dynamics I had been watching. Conversations adjusted. People repositioned. The energy redistributed. I felt the plan wobble. I stepped back, mentally recalculating. The new presence wasn't random. Their timing was too precise, their engagement too intentional. They moved through the space with purpose, connecting dots I hadn't known were connected. That was when it hit me. I hadn't seen the whole board. What I had thought was alignment now looked more like coincidence. The structure beneath the evening was more complex than I'd understood, and my intervention point suddenly felt exposed. Acting now wouldn't reveal the truth. It would reveal me. I pulled back. The decision felt like swallowing something sharp. Every instinct urged me forward, demanded resolution. But instinct without information is recklessness, and recklessness was a luxury I couldn't afford. As the evening progressed, the sense of unraveling intensified. Not externally, but internally. My ally's absence from the space, something we had planned carefully, now felt like a vulnerability rather than a safeguard. Communication was limited by design, but in that moment the silence felt heavier than usual. I was on my own with the choice. I watched her interact with the unexpected variable, noting how easily she adjusted. There was no surprise in her response, no recalibration. She had anticipated this, or at least accounted for it. That realization was sobering. This wasn't a fragile situation teetering on the edge of exposure. It was resilient. The sacrifice came quietly. I let go of an opportunity I had been holding in reserve, a piece of leverage I believed I could deploy if needed. Using it now would have forced a reaction, but not the one I wanted. It would have protected my need for action at the cost of someone else's safety. I chose not to use it. The choice slowed everything down. It pushed resolution further into the future. It meant enduring more uncertainty, more performance, more strain. But it also preserved an essential boundary. There were lines I wasn't willing to cross, even under pressure. I realized then that this wasn't about winning a moment. It was about surviving a process. As the event wound down, nothing dramatic occurred. No exposure, no collapse. Just the gradual dispersal of people conversations, trailing off into nothing. To an outside observer, the night would have seemed entirely forgettable. To me, it was a warning. On the drive home, I said very little. She didn't press. The silence between us felt different now, charged with knowledge she didn't know I had and restraint I hadn't planned to exercise. When we arrived, she moved through the house with the same confidence as before, preparing for the next day, as if nothing significant had occurred. Watching her, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I hadn't acted prematurely. Dread at the realization of how dangerous the endgame might be. Later alone, I replayed the night in detail. The moments where I'd almost acted. The variable that changed everything. The ease with which the situation had absorbed disruption. It forced me to confront a difficult truth. I wasn't dealing with chaos. I was dealing with design. That understanding reframed everything. If this was designed, then it would adapt. If it would adapt, then force alone wouldn't break it. The ending I had imagined, sudden and definitive, was a fantasy. The real ending would require patience I hadn't known I possessed. As I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I accepted what the night had taught me. This wasn't the moment to expose the truth. It was the moment to understand how dangerous exposure would be if mishandled. That night didn't end the story. It showed me how careful the ending would have to be. I knew it was time when the last explanation stopped working, even inside my own head. The certainty didn't come with adrenaline or anger. It arrived as clarity, sharp and quiet. I woke up that morning without the familiar tension in my chest, without the need to rehearse reactions. The waiting was over. Not because I had everything, but because I had enough. Enough alignment. Enough confirmation. Enough understanding of how the structure worked and where it was weakest. Most importantly, I knew where the truth had to surface. Private confrontation would fail. It would turn into denial bargaining, selective memory. Silence would protect the person who had benefited most from it. Any exposure that happened behind closed doors could be reshaped, delayed, reframed. I had watched that kind of control operate too smoothly to believe otherwise. This had to happen in the open. The setting was already scheduled, already unavoidable. A formal meeting tied to shared obligations, not celebration. No champagne, no speeches. Just a room full of people whose presence created accountability by default. Contracts, decisions, reputations. A place where words were recorded and consequences followed. I arrived early not to prepare the room, but to prepare myself. The space was sterile functional. Long table, neutral walls, screens mounted high enough to be seen from every angle. I took a seat that didn't command attention, letting others fill in around me. When she entered, her composure was unchanged, confident, relaxed. She took her place as if this were just another step in a familiar routine. I didn't look at her right away. I waited until the meeting began, until the rhythm settled into something predictable. Agenda items moved forward. Voices rose and fell. Decisions were framed as formalities. It was exactly the kind of environment she trusted, exactly the kind of structure that had always protected her. That protection was about to disappear. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't stand immediately. I let the moment stretch just long enough to feel the room shift. Attention gathered not because I demanded it, but because I waited for it. "I need to address something before we continue," I said. My voice didn't shake. I hadn't raised it. I simply spoke into the silence I had created. A few people glanced at each other, confused, but attentive. "This won't take long," I continued, "but it will change how we proceed from here." She turned to look at me, then curiosity flickering briefly across her face before settling back into composure. She still believed she had room to maneuver. That belief was my final confirmation. I started with the smallest truth. A timeline, a detail that could not be disputed. Dates, overlaps, information already documented, already part of the shared record. Nothing accusatory, just factual alignment presented calmly. Someone interrupted, trying to clarify. I answered without irritation, pointing back to the documentation. The interruption stopped. Attention sharpened. Then I introduced the second truth. A connection that explained the timeline, not framed as motive, but as mechanism. How information moved, how decisions were influenced, how outcomes were shaped without transparency. This time the room reacted. Murmurs, shifting in seats. Someone leaned forward to see the screen more clearly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to yet. Denial works best when deployed early, and she was waiting for the right moment. I didn't give it to her. The third truth was the one she didn't know I had. I hadn't announced how I acquired it or who had helped me. I didn't need to. I presented it the same way I had presented everything else. Calmly, precisely, without commentary. The kind of information that doesn't require interpretation once it's visible. The room went still. I watched her face change, then not dramatically, but definitively. The confidence drained, first replaced by calculation. Then the calculation faltered. There was nowhere left to redirect attention, no alternative explanation that fit the facts now laid out in front of everyone. This was the moment denial stopped working. She tried anyway. "That's not what it looks like," she said, her voice steady but tight. "You're misunderstanding the context." "I'm not," I replied without raising my voice, "and neither is anyone else in this room." I didn't argue. I didn't counter her point by point. I simply moved forward, presenting the final alignment. The piece that connected everything. The one that explained not just what had happened, but why it had been hidden. That was when the collapse began. Questions came from around the table, not directed at me, but at her. Requests for clarification, demands for explanation. Each one tightened the space around her, reducing her options. She answered a few, evaded others. Her voice grew sharper, less controlled. The room responded to that shift immediately. People who had once deferred to her began to pull back. Alliances recalibrated in real time. I said nothing. There was no satisfaction in watching it happen, just inevitability. Structures don't fall all at once. They lose support incrementally until gravity finishes the work. When the chair called for a pause, I stood. "I've said what I came to say," I told the room. "The information is there. What you do with it is no longer my responsibility." I didn't look at her as I gathered my things. I didn't wait for acknowledgement or apology. Closure doesn't come from people who built systems to avoid it. As I walked out, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not relieved, not triumphant, just unburdened. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, cleaner. I stood for a moment, breathing it in, letting the noise of the city replace the quiet pressure I had lived under for too long. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't read. Notifications could wait. The truth was no longer contained. It would move on its own now, carried by people who had witnessed it directly. I understood then that exposure isn't about punishment. It's about removing protection. Once the protection is gone, consequences follow naturally. Later that day, I returned home to an empty house. The silence felt earned. I didn't replay the meeting in my mind. I didn't second-guess what I had said or how I had said it. For the first time since the ultrasound appointment, my thoughts were still. The vigilance I had maintained for so long relaxed Not because danger was gone, but because it had changed form. The truth was no longer something I had to guard. That night, as I went to bed, I realized I hadn't thought about revenge once. I hadn't needed to. The exposure had done what confrontation never could. It had removed me from the center of the conflict and placed the facts where they belonged, in the open. Once the truth was exposed, I didn't need to fight anymore. The fallout would take care of itself. The morning after the truth surfaced, the house felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been broken. The furniture stood where it always had. The light entered through the same windows. The clock on the wall kept the same time. And yet the space felt altered, as if the air itself had been rearranged. I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the quiet, realizing how much noise I had been carrying inside me until it was suddenly gone. I made coffee and drank it slowly, not because I wanted to savor it, but because there was no reason to rush anymore. Messages arrived throughout the morning. Some were brief professional acknowledgments. Others were longer, filled with confusion, concern, or attempts at explanation. A few people said nothing at all, and their silence was just as informative. I didn't respond right away. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel obligated to manage anyone else's understanding of events. The truth was no longer mine to defend. What followed wasn't chaos, but realignment. Conversations shifted. Plans were reconsidered. People adjusted their positions, recalculated loyalties, redefined distance. I watched it happen without stepping in, without offering guidance or commentary. That phase belonged to them. My role had ended the moment I walked out of that room. There were costs I hadn't spoken about during the exposure, costs that didn't make headlines or inspire reactions. Trust doesn't vanish cleanly. It leaves residue. I found myself hesitating before answering simple questions, checking my own instincts for bias, wondering how long it would take before ease returned without effort. Some losses didn't announce themselves at all. They appeared later quietly when I realized certain assumptions would never return. That kind of loss doesn't hurt sharply. It dulls slowly. Revenge hadn't brought relief. I hadn't expected it to. What surprised me was how much energy I had been spending just holding everything together. Once that effort stopped, the fatigue surfaced all at once. I slept more, thought less, allowed myself moments of stillness without suspicion. In that stillness, I took inventory of what remained. My sense of self, for one. I hadn't compromised it to maintain comfort. I hadn't turned cruelty into justification or confusion into aggression. That mattered to me more than any outcome I couldn't control. There were also a few relationships that survived intact, not many. But the ones that did felt clearer, stripped of pretense. They didn't ask for details. They didn't demand explanations. They accepted what I offered and respected what I withheld. Those connections felt rare and valuable in a way I hadn't appreciated before. I spent time reflecting on the lessons I had learned, not as rules to follow, but as truths earned through experience. I learned that stability can be real and still be misleading. That calm doesn't always mean safety. That intuition isn't dramatic, it's persistent. I learned that power doesn't come from exposure itself, but from timing and restraint, from knowing when to speak and when silence serves you better. Most of all, I learned that trusting someone doesn't mean surrendering your awareness. Love and vigilance are not opposites. They can exist in the same space if you let them. People asked me later why I hadn't acted sooner, why I had waited until things reached that point. The answer was simple, even if it wasn't comfortable. Acting too early would have protected my emotions, not the truth. Waiting allowed the structure to reveal itself fully. That distinction mattered. I didn't share my story to be seen as strong or clever. I shared it because I know how easy it is to dismiss quiet warning, how tempting it is to choose convenience over curiosity, how comforting it feels to believe that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. They don't. If there's one reason I'm telling this now, it's because someone listening may recognize pieces of their own life in mine. Not the details, but the feeling, the subtle unease, the sense that something doesn't align even when everything looks fine. If that's you, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you not to ignore it. Pay attention to patterns. Notice who controls information and how. Trust people who respect your awareness, not those who rely on your silence. And if you find yourself questioning whether you're overthinking, ask yourself a better question instead. What happens if you're not? Life didn't become perfect after the exposure. It became honest. And honesty, I've learned, is quieter than drama, but far more durable. I'm still moving forward one ordinary day at a time, building a future that isn't based on performance or assumption, but on clarity. That's enough for me. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever sensed something was wrong long before you had proof? Did you listen to that feeling, or did you talk yourself out of it? Share your thoughts in the comments. This channel exists so we don't carry these experiences alone. And if you want to stay with us for more stories like this, stories about hidden truths, hard lessons, and quiet strength, earn the long way, consider subscribing. Not for the drama, but for the wisdom that comes after it. We don't share these stories to shock you. We share them so you might recognize the moment when it matters most.